Right, so when it comes to string gauges, a lot of it is to do with personal preference and stuff, but when you've been playing for a certain amount of time, you kind of pick up on certain things that beginners might not be aware of or be able to hear, just because with time your hearing kind of develops a bit to noticing the subtle differences in sounds that after you've been playing for, well over 10 years, that you can really pick up on certain things. So me personally, I play 11 to 49 D'Addario strings, which are, I think, the medium jazz rock ones. So it's an 11 gauge, 14, I can't remember all of them, but it's 11 to 49. So I'm lucky enough to be endorsed by D'Addario, and I'm sure they could do me some custom sets of exactly the gauges that I want, but I've got some weird OCD thing where I just like to know that I can walk into any music shop and definitely get the gauge strings that I use on all my guitars, just for the sake of ease, which is very rarely. A lot of the time I get my strings directly from them. But anyway, so the reason I choose them is it's quite thick, quite heavy gauge for standard E tuning, but it's for our sort of music when you're playing really fast, tight, aggressive thrash stuff and I'm having to pick really fast. I use quite heavy picks. I use the Dunlop 1.14 ones. And you want an aggressive sound. If you're using strings that are going to be flopping about, you really, they're going to be wobbling about too much when you really want them to snap back into place and for you to keep picking really fast. I also found tonally that the 49, like the low strings for chords and stuff, resonate really well. I did have a problem where I used to play 10 to 52 gauge strings, and it wasn't until we were in the studio recording our first album that I realised that the 52, when you go too heavy, even though I was quite used to the way they felt, was adding sort of like a scrapey, scratchy tone, and it was just a little bit too thick. Sometimes you do need a certain amount of slack in the string for it to sound, just right, but you definitely don't want to go the opposite end and play nines and stuff if you're playing heavy music. So for me, for especially our sort of music, nines I'd say are pretty much out of the question, because when it comes down to it, the majority of the songs are riffing. We're not we do have solos and lead stuff, but it's not the focus of what we do. We focus on songs and riffs and stuff. So having nines, the problem with playing with nines is they don't really resonate as much. They're not the tension is obviously not there, so they're not really as loud and punchy sounding. Tens are really good for E, but again for us, if you're doing really sort of technical kind of playing, on the low strings especially, when you really want to kind of riff fast and dig in. Obviously digging in hard and palm muting hard and everything like that is what gives it the aggressive sound. So it's really hard to do that when your strings are kind of flopping about a bit. Ideally for me, I'd like tens on the high three strings, but I like the 49, the low three strings, the way they feel, and I just stick with the set that I use because of that. So like I say, it is personal preference, but you have to consider if you go too light, your guitar's not really going to be resonating as much. Your strings just won't have enough sustain. They kind of feel a bit more dead. It's obviously really good for your legato and stuff. It kind of depends on the tuning. My recommendations, especially for people playing metal or heavy rock and stuff, or even jazz. I mean, jazz players tend to go way heavier string gauge wise, but if you're an E standard, I'd stick with tens if you're playing a lot of riffy kind of stuff, or 11 to 49s like we do. And if you're in, drop D, you can get away with it with the 10s, with a 10 to 46, but 46 just doesn't quite have that resonance, so I'd stick to a 49 or the 10 to 52s, which are really good for that kind of stuff. One thing that I recommend to beginners playing is not to go with really light strings. It's obviously a lot easier to play with nines or whatever, but you should really just try and build up your finger strength. My first year of playing guitar was on an acoustic steel string guitar, and quite a cheap one, so it wasn't set up the best way it could have been in terms of the action and stuff. So you really need to, I recommend actually using like either heavy strings on a electric guitar or even learning steel string to really build up that strength. You'll notice later on, it depends on what kind of music you play, that if you do switch to something like nines after years of playing heavy strings, you'll be all up and down the fretboard. Like every time I play a friend's guitar and they've got like tens or nines on, I just kind of realise I'm a lot better at playing guitar than I am on my own guitars. But it's kind of good to just keep that strength consistent and everything, and not, keep playing flimsy strings. I can't say I've really messed around with anything lower than E or D in terms of lower tunings, but a good thing to do is try and tune a guitar to like standard E with some 11s or 10s, and try and match that kind of the feel you get, the tension with heavier gauge strings, and whichever tuning you're going down to, try and match it to the way those strings feel.